Montana Territory. August of 1874, the sun was still low when the cowboy saw her. Landon Keene reined in his chestnut gelding at the edge of a narrow creek, the morning light catching against his battered hat brim. He had been riding since dawn, trailing a lost steer from the broken tail herd. The cow had wandered off the night before, and though he had found its tracks, it was the figure by the water that made him forget the animal altogether. A young woman was crouched at the creek's edge, cupping water into her hand. She wore a wide-brimmed straw hat, her dark brown braid falling down her back. Strapped to her shoulders in a worn blue sling was a baby barely more than a year old, by the look of it his little face tucked against her back, sleeping soundly. Landon nudged his horse forward a few steps, boots creaking in the stirrups. "You all right, miss?" he called out, voice steady but gentle. She spun, rising fast, one hand going protectively to the baby's back. Her eyes met his sharp, guarded but not cruel. "He is fine," she said first, breath catching. "We just needed water. I meant you." He dismounted, slow and careful, holding the reins loose. "You are a long way from any town." She looked him over, noting the revolver at his hip, the dust on his boots, the honest eyes. "You are not a marshal." "No, ma'am, just a cowboy, Landon Keene. I ride for the Broken Tail about 10 miles east." She hesitated, then nodded once. "Ruth Harlan." He glanced at the baby strapped to her back. "Yours?" Her lips parted, and for a heartbeat she looked almost offended. "No." "I am not the mama," she said, voice low but firm. "I am the sister." Landon raised his brows. "All right." He softened his tone. "Did something happen to your folks?" She looked away, jaw tight. "My brother and his wife Samson's real mama and papa were headed west from St. Louis. I was with them. A fever took her first, then him. 2 weeks later, I buried them near the river fork." Landon's throat tightened. "And now you are walking with a baby on your back, alone." "I was not waiting to die in a wagon with strangers. Got food, got water, and I have him." She turned her head slightly so she could touch the baby's hand with hers. "That is all I need." "You need more than that," Landon said. "You need rest, safety, shelter." "I do not trust men who offer things without asking why," she said, her chin lifting. He held her gaze. "Then ask me." She watched him a long moment, the only sound the creek moving over stones and the baby's small breath. "Why would you help me?" she asked. "Because I have seen too many graves out here, and I do not want to ride past another one." Ruth looked away again, and this time her shoulders sagged. "I had hoped to reach Fort Benton. Someone there might take us in, maybe find him a home." "He already has someone," Landon said gently, nodding toward the baby. She blinked hard but didn't argue. "I have a cabin," he said. "A few hours' ride. It is not much, but it is safe. Got a spare bed, food, a roof." "You live alone?" she asked. "I do." She stared at him, searching for lies. She found none. Ruth stepped back, adjusted the sling on her shoulders. "He is heavy," she admitted quietly. "I got a saddle blanket you can use to pad him. Horse can carry both of you." She hesitated again, then gave a short nod. Landon helped her up, lifting her gently into the saddle with Samson still asleep against her. He rode beside them, hand on the reins, his chest tight the whole way back. It was past noon when they reached his place, a small, 2-room cabin near a patch of pine trees with a wooden corral and a split-rail fence. Ruth climbed down on her own, stiff-legged and quiet, eyes scanning every corner like she was ready to run. Landon filled a basin with water and set it on the porch. "You can wash up if you want. I will fix something to eat." "Thank you," she said, soft now. He nodded and stepped inside. Over stew and hard bread, she told him more. Her brother had been a carpenter, her sister-in-law a quiet, kind woman. They had been aiming for Oregon. When the fever came, Ruth had done what she could, but there was no doctor, no medicine, just her and a baby. I could have left him, she said, eyes on her bowl. But I couldn't. I would not have respected you if you had, Landon said. She looked up then, and something moved between them, quiet but real. That night, she laid the baby in his spare bed and curled on the floor beside him, refusing the cot Landon offered her. You do not have to sleep on the ground, he said, frowning. I do not take more than I need, she replied. He gave her a blanket and let it be. The next morning, Ruth was already outside, hanging 2 shirts on the line. She had cleaned the baby, washed his sling, and even swept the porch. You do not have to do chores, Landon said as he stepped outside. I do not sit still well, she said, not looking at him. He watched her a moment. He is lucky to have you. I am not doing this for praise. I know. That is why it means something. She glanced back, eyes softening. Samson woke then, crying out. Ruth moved fast, lifting him into her arms, cradling him against her chest. The baby settled quickly, tiny fingers curling into Ruth's collar. Landon leaned against the post, watching them. You are good with him. I had no choice, but I love him. He is all I have left. You are not alone anymore, Landon said. She looked at him again, something deep and uncertain in her eyes. He stepped closer. I know it has only been a day, but I am not going anywhere. I have heard that before, she whispered. I am not your brother. I do not make promises I cannot keep. She did not answer, but she did not step away either. That night, she let him bring the cot into the room with the baby. And when she fell asleep, she did not wake up every hour to check the door. By the 3rd day, Ruth laughed for the first time. Landon had been trying to hammer a new board onto the porch rail and hit his thumb instead. He cursed, dropped the hammer, then saw her watching. You are not very good at this, she said. He looked at her, eyes narrowing. I am better at fences. She laughed again, covering her mouth, and Samson giggled too, as if hearing her happiness made him happy too. Landon rubbed his sore hand, grinning. Worth it. She looked at him for a long time, then turned back to her sewing, but her smile stayed. That evening, after Ruth had laid Samson down, she stepped out onto the porch where Landon was watching the stars. I used to think Montana would be lonelier than Missouri, she said, arms folded. But it is not anymore. He turned to her. You are not alone, Ruth. She looked at him. Neither are you. And for the first time since she had buried her brother, she reached for someone. Landon took her hand, letting it settle into his, warm and sure. They stood like that, side by side, under the stars, 2 people who had nothing left, finding something true in the quiet. The sun broke later that morning, filtered through a sky streaked in pale gold. Ruth sat on the cabin stoop with Samson in her lap, wrapped in one of Landon's old flannel shirts she'd mended the night before. The boy had started teething, and his quiet fussing stirred her from sleep just past first light. She rocked him with one arm while her other hand worked slowly over a strip of muslin she'd torn into swaddles. Behind her, the door creaked open. Landon stepped out with a tin mug in one hand, steam curling up from the rim. His hair was still damp from washing, darker at the temples where it clung to his skin. He up early. He never really went down, Ruth said, rubbing slow circles on the baby's back. He's warm. Might be a fever coming. He crouched beside her to feel Samson's brow with the back of his fingers gentle, like he'd done it before. Could be teeth, he said. Or the change in weather. Nights have been colder. She nodded and shifted the child in her arms. I'll keep him close today. Landon didn't move. His eyes lingered on the curve of her jaw, the faint hollows beneath her eyes. You didn't sleep. No time for it, she said, brushing her braid behind her shoulder. I needed to boil the linens, and I wanted to finish patching that second shirt of yours before the seams gave out. You're running yourself thin. I've been thinner. He didn't argue the point. Instead, he set his mug down and stood. I'll cut more kindling. Stove's greedy in the morning. She nodded. and when he disappeared around the corner, she let her head rest back against the post, Samson's breath warm against her collarbone. Later, while the baby slept curled in a basket lined with sheepskin, Ruth moved through the cabin's single room with a rhythm shaped by necessity. She rinsed out the wash basin, refolded the bedding, and collected the last of the herbs she'd hung near the stove, wild yarrow and horehound mostly, gathered from the slope above the pasture. She ground them down with the heel of her palm, working them into a poultice in case Samson's fever rose. The door opened again, and Landon stepped in with an armful of dry wood. He set it by the hearth, then straightened, brushing sawdust from his sleeves. "You ever work as a nurse?" he asked. "No, but I stayed healthy while others didn't." "Learn to watch for signs early." He looked at the small bundle of crushed leaves and cloth she'd set on the table. "You don't guess at things. Guessing wastes time. Then you'll do fine here." She lifted her eyes from the herbs. "You want me to stay?" "I do." "For how long?" He didn't answer right away. His hand rested on the back of one of the chairs, thumb brushing the smooth wood like he was steadying himself. "As long as you want to." "As long as you need." Ruth looked away toward the window where the light filtered soft through the burlap curtain. "I'm not used to having choices." "You've earned a few, haven't you?" She didn't speak, but her fingers eased their grip on the cloth in her lap. That afternoon, Landon saddled his gelding and rode out to check the far fence line. Ruth stayed back, tending to Samson and starting a broth with salt pork and wild onion. She kept the fire steady and the doors latched, though the land felt safe now in a way it hadn't before. When Landon returned near sundown, he brought with him a bundle tied in oilcloth. "Found these left behind in the bunkhouse," he said as he set it down on the porch beside her. "Old baby clothes, clean, figured he might grow into them." She untied the cloth slowly, fingers tracing over the fabric. A tiny cotton shirt, woolen booties, a bonnet made of soft brown flannel. "They were yours?" she asked. "My sister's," he said. "She lost her baby last spring, buried him under the ash tree out back." Ruth looked up. "I didn't know you had family close." "I don't. She left after the funeral. Went east to stay with cousins in Springfield. We haven't heard since." She folded the items carefully, her hands working slower than usual. "I'm sorry." He sat beside her, his shoulder brushing hers. "It's strange. I didn't think I'd ever see these again. But when I saw him," he nodded toward the sleeping baby inside, "it felt right." They sat quiet for a while, the only sound the wind moving through the grass. "Your sister," Ruth said softly. "Did she leave by choice?" She couldn't stay. Too many memories. I didn't fault her for it. I used to think running made a person weak. It doesn't, but staying takes a different kind of strength. Ruth turned her head toward him. "You think I have that? I know you do." The sun dipped lower, and shadows stretched long across the porch. Ruth reached for the bonnet, turning it over in her lap. "When he's older," she said, "he won't remember any of this. Not the road, not the loss, maybe not even me." Landon leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "He'll remember who raised him." "That stays." She looked at him, and this time her gaze didn't flinch. "You talk like you've lived through it." "I have." She didn't press him to say more. That evening, Ruth read aloud from a worn Bible she found on the shelf, her voice low, and even while Landon carved a strip of pine into a rattle for Samson. The light from the stove danced across the floorboards, and the baby stirred in his sleep but didn't wake. When she finished reading, Ruth set the book aside and turned toward the man near the hearth. "You always live this quiet?" He looked up, knife paused in his hand. "Wasn't always like this. I used to ride with a crew. Long drives down to Texas, hauling cattle through dust and hail. Nights full of noise and cards and shouting. This," he gestured to the room, "is better. Because it's quiet. No, because you're in it." She lowered her eyes, but her hand found the edge of the chair nearest his, and after a moment he reached out and covered it with his. Not hurried, not uncertain, just sure. The fire cracked softly behind them and the wind outside rustled through the pine. Neither of them said another word that night. They didn't need to. The first snow came early. Not much, just a dusting, but enough to silver the tops of the fence posts and whisper across the roof in the night. Ruth stepped outside before dawn, her shawl pulled tight, breath rising white in the air. The land wore its stillness like a second skin, and as she stood there, Samson stirring against her shoulder, she felt the weight of the changing season press gently into the space between what had been and what might come. Inside, Landon was already at the stove, stirring something in the cast iron pot with the same quiet focus he gave everything. He didn't look over when she came in, just said, "It'll warm you through." She settled Samson in the cradle Landon had built from pine slats and rawhide. The baby blinked sleepily, then reached out to the carved horse Ruth had tied above him with a length of red yarn. As Ruth peeled off her shawl, she caught the scent of cloves and something earthy she couldn't place. "You used the dried parsnips," she said. He nodded, ladling the stew into 2 bowls. And the marrow bone, figured it'd stretch better that way. He handed her a bowl, their hands brushing. She took it without a word and sat across from him at the table. "Did you ever think about leaving this place?" she asked. He didn't answer right away. "Back when the herd was bigger, I thought about heading south, maybe into the New Mexico territory, but I couldn't see myself starting over again, not after what happened here." Ruth studied him. "You lost more than your sister's boy." He looked down at his bowl, spoon resting still. "My father built this place by hand. Took him 6 seasons. After he passed, I kept it going. My mother left the year after. She said the silence made her feel buried." "I don't mind quiet," Ruth said. "I know." The stew cooled between them. Ruth set her spoon aside. "You think you'll ever go back to Missouri?" he asked. She shook her head. "There's nothing left there. And even if there was, I'm not the same girl that left." He leaned back, arms crossed loosely. "And who are you now?" She didn't flinch. "Someone who knows what she can carry, and what she won't ever set down." Landon's eyes flicked toward Samson, who had fallen asleep with one chubby hand curled near his cheek. "You don't have to keep carrying it alone." "I'm not." Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters. Ruth stood and moved to the hearth, where the fire had burned low. She added a split log and nudged the embers until the flames caught again. "I want to make a place for him," she said, still facing the fire. "Not just a roof, a steadiness, somewhere he can belong without asking." "You already have," Landon said. She turned, her hands warming at her sides. "It's not finished yet." "No." But it started. That afternoon, while Samson napped, they took apart the old chicken coop behind the barn. Ruth held the board steady while Landon pried rusted nails loose with the back of a hatchet. They said little, but their movements fell into rhythm, no wasted steps, no second guessing. "We could use this lumber for a smokehouse," Landon said as he stacked the planks. Ruth nodded. "Or a root cellar cover. The ground's going to freeze deeper this year. You've got a good eye for winter." "I watched my brother build a lean-to every fall. He always said it was easier to plan cold than to survive it." Landon reached for another board. "What else did he teach you?" She wiped dust from her hands. "How to read a sky, which trees split first in a storm, how to tell if a man was lying by the way he held his mouth." He paused. "And me? You don't try to look safe. You just are." He didn't reply, but the next board he pulled loose, he handed to her without looking. That evening, after supper, Ruth stood by the window with a piece of mending in her lap. Landon sat near the fire, whittling a spoon from a crooked branch he'd found by the creek. The room was quiet but not empty. "I was thinking." Ruth said, not looking up, "about building a small pen for Samson, so he can be outside come spring and not crawl into the woodpile." Landon set the knife down. "I'll help you draw it out. I don't want him to feel fenced in, just safe." "I get it." She looked at him then. "You ever think about having your own?" He hesitated. "I used to. Before the world got smaller." "You think it's smaller now?" He met her eyes. "No, not anymore." She folded the shirt in her lap, the stitching done. "I don't know what comes next," she said. "I do," he replied. "We wake up, we feed him, we fix what needs fixing. And we don't do it alone." She stood then, slow and sure, and crossed to where he sat. Her hand found his shoulder, not tentative but steady. He covered it with his own. When she leaned down, he rose to meet her, no rush, no question. Their lips met like a promise spoken without sound. When Samson cried softly in his sleep, Ruth pulled back and turned toward him. Landon followed. Together they knelt beside the cradle. Ruth lifted the baby into her arms and Landon tucked the blanket back around him. "He's warm," Ruth whispered. "He's home," Landon said. And this time, she didn't correct him. By mid-November, the creek behind the cabin had frozen over in the shallows, and the ground held the kind of cold that didn't lift with the sun. Ruth had taken to keeping dried apples warming on the stove's side ledge for Samson to chew on. His gums were swollen, but he was sitting up now, hands reaching for everything: Ruth's braid, Landon's shirt buttons, the spoon left too close to the cradle. Landon came in from the barn one afternoon with a coil of wire over his shoulder and a streak of soot on his cheek. "Chimney flue's clear now," he said, pulling off his gloves. "You'll be able to cook without smoke flooding the room." Ruth didn't look up from the cloth she was sewing into a narrow pillowcase. "You didn't have to climb the roof in this wind." "I didn't want you doing it. I wasn't going to." "Well, now neither of us has to." She set the needle down and rubbed her eyes. "You always do things before I ask." "I don't always wait to be asked." She studied him, then stood and crossed to the hearth. "You ever think about building on? Cabin small," he said, "but it's enough. It's enough now, won't be if we stay." He leaned against the table, hands at his sides. "You thinking of staying?" "I'm thinking about what makes sense." He didn't answer right away. Ruth stirred the pot on the stove, barley thickening in broth, then turned back toward him. "You never talk about what you wanted before this place." "I don't remember wanting much." "That's not true." "I used to think about having land that was mine, not my father's, not part of the herd drive, just mine. But I didn't know what I'd do with it once I had it. And now I'd plant something, build a fence with a purpose other than keeping things out, maybe even fix the porch right." "You already did." He smiled, faint and real. "Then I'd just sit on it with you." She folded her arms. "You'd need another chair." "I've got one. But not for a child." He straightened. "You mean to raise him here?" "I mean to raise him," she said. "If it's here, it's because you want us." "I do." She stepped closer. "Not out of pity. No, not because it's the decent thing. Because I want a life, and I want it with you." Her throat moved as she swallowed. "I never wanted to be anyone's burden. You're not. You never were." The wind shifted outside, brushing snow from the eaves. Inside, the warmth built slow and steady. "You never asked me what I did before the trail," Ruth said. "I figured you'd tell me when you were ready. I worked in a mill, spinning thread. 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. My brother used to wait outside when my shift ended. Said I walked like someone waiting for a break that wouldn't come." Landon rested his hand on the table. "He was right. I didn't know what rest felt like until I got here." He stepped forward, slow. "And now you do." She met his eyes. "I do." He reached out, not rushing, and took her hand. Her fingers closed around his like they'd done it 100 times. From the cradle, Samson let out a soft sigh and turned in his sleep. Ruth glanced over, then back at Landon. "I want him to know what steadiness looks like," she said. He will. Then we need to build it. We will. She leaned forward, resting her forehead briefly against his chest. He stood still, arms wrapping around her with a quiet certainty. The broth bubbled low on the stove behind them, and the snow thickened beyond the window, blanketing the world in white. They didn't make plans out loud that night. They didn't need to. The next morning, Landon brought in a bundle of cedar slats and a tin box of nails. Ruth watched from the doorway, Samson balanced on her hip, as he laid the first board across the frozen ground beside the porch. "Thought I'd start framing a second room," he said. She stepped outside, adjusted the baby on her hip, and looked at where the sun hit the snow. "I'll help with the measuring." He handed her the chalk line, and together they began. The rafters had been up for a week before the first proper snow came thick enough to muffle the world. Ruth stood barefoot near the stove, Samson on her hip, watching flakes drift past the window in slow loops. The new room's walls were framed, not yet sealed, but Landon had stacked hay bales along the exposed sides to keep the worst of the cold from creeping in. He came in from the barn with his coat damp, and his shoulders dusted white. Ruth handed him a towel without a word, and he dried off by the fire, steam rising faintly from his sleeves. "You hungry?" she asked, shifting Samson to her other side as she stirred cornmeal into a pot on the stove. "Not just yet," he said, eyes still on her. "Was thinking about that land up past the ridge." She tilted her head. "The scrub flat. There's a spring under it, not much but steady. Wouldn't take much to build a channel down to the corral. Animals would have a better winter with it." She nodded, easing into the chair across from him. "Could plant come spring, too." "Would you want that?" "I would." He looked over at Samson, who was chewing quietly on the edge of Ruth's apron tie. "He'll be walking by then." Ruth smiled, brushing the boy's hair back from his forehead. "He's already trying." Landon reached across the table, resting his hand lightly on her forearm. "I want to put in a window in the new room, one that faces east." She looked down at his hand, then back at him. "To catch the morning light, to see your face in it." She flushed, but didn't look away. "That's a good reason." The snow kept falling steady through the day, and by dusk it had covered the fences clean. Ruth lit the oil lamp while Landon brought in another armload of wood. The baby slept wrapped in a quilt, cheeks pink from the warmth of the fire. They sat close that night, both of them on the floor near the hearth, backs against the wall, knees just touching. Ruth worked a patch onto one of Samson's shirts. Landon whittled a small bird from a block of cedar, its wings curved as if mid-flight. "You ever been in love before?" Ruth asked, voice low. He didn't hesitate. "Once. When I was 19. She married a banker in Helena before I could ask her to stay. Did it hurt for a while? But not like I thought it would. I think I knew she wasn't meant for this life." Ruth set the needle down. "And me? You built your life with your own hands. I trust that more than anything." She leaned her head back, eyes soft. "I used to think love was what you felt when someone made you forget the hard things. And now I think it's what happens when someone helps carry them." He reached over, brushing his thumb along her cheekbone. "Let me carry them with you." She turned toward his touch. "You already are." That night they brought the cradle closer to the bed, where the heat from the stove reached best. Ruth laid Samson down, then turned to find Landon behind her, his hand outstretched. She took it. There was no ceremony, no preacher. Just the two of them, standing in the cabin they'd built together in the quiet of a Montana winter, speaking truths with their bodies and eyes and hands. Landon kissed her like it was a promise, his palm against the small of her back. Ruth leaned into it, into him, into everything they'd made. In the weeks that followed, the wind came harder, but the walls held. The new room was sealed with packed moss and chinked with care. Ruth painted a small row of wildflowers along the lower beam with leftover ochre from a barn sign Landon had never finished. Samson took his first steps across the plank floor between their outstretched arms, laughing with each stumble. Ruth cried, not from sadness, but from the quiet joy of watching something grow where so much had once been lost. Word spread slowly through the valley that Landon Keene had taken in a woman and her child. A few neighbors came by with early gifts: quilt squares, dried beans, a hand-carved cradle rocker. No one asked questions. They didn't need to. By spring, the ground had softened enough to turn. Ruth planted potatoes and onions near the back fence. Landon dug a trench for the spring water, and they laid stone along the channel to keep it from washing out. One morning, Ruth woke to find a ring of woven grass beside her pillow. Landon wasn't a man for jewelry, but she knew what it meant. She wore it tied to a leather cord around her neck, over her collarbone where his hands sometimes rested as they stood watching the sun rise. They didn't call each other husband and wife, not out loud, but everyone who came to the cabin saw what they were. A family, whole, steady. Years passed. The land changed with the seasons, but the house stayed firm. Ruth made a second cradle when their daughter was born, a quiet girl with dark eyes and Landon's calm manner. Samson grew tall and sure-footed and called her Ma without hesitation. They built more onto the cabin: a pantry, a porch swing, a smokehouse by the tree line. Ruth planted asters along the path, and Landon carved their names into the frame above the door. They didn't speak often of what had come before: the trail, the loss, the long silence, but it was there, underneath everything, making what they had now more solid, more real. One quiet evening in late summer, Ruth sat on the porch steps, her dress hemmed damp from the creek. Landon came to sit beside her, his hand settling on hers without a word. "Never thought I'd be this happy," she said softly. "You made it so," he answered. "No," she turned to him, eyes full. "We did." And as the sun dipped low behind the hills, painting the sky in colors neither of them had names for, they sat side by side, their children asleep inside, the land around them rich and alive. They had endured. They had built. And they had done it together, with love earned, quiet and deep, the kind that didn't fade.